My name is David Lucas. I'm an assistant professor at Syracuse University, and I'm going to talk about my paper, Third-Party Standards and Sustainability Reporting, the case of Minnesota benefit corporations. Now, for-profit businesses are increasingly pursuing goals in the public interest alongside their profit maximization pursuits. You have recent prominent examples like Warby Parker, Allbirds, and Lemonade, and many other companies that are expressly embedding these kind of values and pursuits into their organizational identity. We call these kinds of for-profit businesses hybrid ventures because they are trying to sort of straddle the private and public, if you will, goals for organizations. Now, such hybrid ventures, they often make claims about what they've done that's so great, about the value that they generate in the public interest, about the things that are done for stakeholders. But unlike profit or other traditional examples of bottom line, it's a little bit less established in terms of what that means and how you verify and validate. And as such, there's considerable debate about how reliable these claims are. Are they the just articulation of authentic commitments, or are they instances of greenwashing? And of course, that probably depends to some extent on the instance. But the overall question is, how do you facilitate accountability and transparency for businesses that have opted to make this part of their identity claims? Now, there's a growing plethora of legislative and private sector solutions to promote that accountability. One prominent tool is sustainability reporting. This is the idea that we should measure and disclose those things and benchmarks and performance and practices against some kind of standards as a way to be accountable to internal and external stakeholders. Sustainability reporting is really growing both internationally and within the United States as a requirement by certain regulations for some firms or by third-party organizations, for example, as a contingency of measurement of membership and a certification, what have you. But there's little research on the interdependence of these, even though they often are both present for a given organizational population. So you have top-down legislative criteria that are enforced by a state. Then you have bottom-up market-based governance mechanisms. And so there's only a growing and recent body of work starting to ask how these relate to one another and how organizations navigate them in conjunction. That's what this paper is about. So my research questions are: one, how do hybrid ventures navigate compliance with sustainability reporting laws? And two, what role do third-party standards play in this process of navigating compliance? As context, I'm studying benefit corporation legislation, BCL, in the US, and specifically studying the benefit corporations that have been created or adopted this legal form that's created by the legislation. Now, BCL was passed by about 35 or so states, Washington, D.C., and actually several countries, including Italy and some others. And what the BCL does is it creates a legal form to try and accommodate these hybrid ventures. So it's for-profit businesses that have written into their charter some public purpose, whether it be a general effort to create public value or some specific set of stakeholders that are meant to be benefited in conjunction with the pursuits and considerations of the shareholders. Now, one of the key requirements of benefit corporations in almost every piece of legislation is the creation of and publication of a benefit report. It's a kind of sustainability report, if you will, relating those goals to actual performance achieved, and it's often on an annual basis. Minnesota, the context that I'll study, is unique in that they fairly well enforce the creation and submission of these reports to the Secretary of State. Some states don't require that it be publicly submitted, just posted to a website or distributed to shareholders. And in such states, there's research finding that compliance tends to be fairly low, especially in the face of limited enforcement. But Minnesota is a case where, at least anecdotally, there's some evidence that compliance with the production of reports is really high. And so I'm going to study these benefit corporations and their reporting practices, specifically with B-Lab in mind. B-Lab is a prominent nonprofit organization that has produced third-party standards and some pretty strong private governance, at least for the organizations that have adopted their certification. Those are certified B corporations. And if you look at this graph, you see the intersection of these two is of particular interest. If thinking about benefit corporations, what is the role of that certification and what is the influence of B-Lab in terms of the third-party standards that they provide? because there's very little clarity about the scope or expectations of what a benefit report should actually look like and include and what it means to have a more very transparent organization with respect to this tool. We might expect B-Lab to play a significant role in providing structure for that. So as a theoretical backdrop, we can think of sustainability reporting as really a kind of self-regulation, or at least an area where there's considerable room for self-regulation. Even though it's a legislative requirement to produce one, there is extreme ambiguity about what should go in that report. The most that it'll say in some cases is that a third-party standard is required and some very general details about what should be in there, but there's no length limits. There's very limited sort of guidance ex ante. And hence, there's a role for private actors, and in this case, conceptually, what I'm calling legal intermediaries. These are just organizations and collectives in the private sector that play a role in shaping what compliance actually ends up meaning as the law unfolds, and in this case, compliance with sustainability reporting requirements in the BCL. In our case, my position is that B-Lab acts as a legal intermediary in terms of the BCL. For one, they played a role in the emergence of many of these laws for many states, kind of mobilizing grassroots support for it. But they also provide these third-party standards that certified firms use, but also non-certified firms may measure themselves against because they're publicly available. And they set expectations in turn for what it means to produce a benefit report and to, if you will, create social value. So I'm going to develop some simple hypotheses about this interdependence by theorizing the role of B Corp and third-party standards in general on reporting depth. And in this case, I'm just focusing on depth as a first step to study these differences in what information is disclosed. So the first hypothesis is that benefit corporations that are B Corp certified will produce more extensive annual benefit reports than those that are not certified. The notion being that because B Corps are subject to a rigorous third-party standard, they're going to go above and beyond. Even when compliance isn't required of a certain length, they will stand out in that regard. Second hypothesis has to do with the legal distinctions among organizations subjected to any third-party standard versus those that are not. And we basically, my argument is that the private sector is going to play a role in ratcheting up those expectations, yielding longer reports. The third hypothesis is that among firms that are not B Corp certified, so those that haven't reached that certification, there is still some role for B-Lab's influence through the provision of those standards. It's kind of a spillover effect, if you will, of their efforts to provide accountability. So benefit corporations that reference B-Lab in those benefit reports are going to have more extensive reports than those that make no mention of. So to study these things, I'm going to collect, and I did collect a unique data set of the population of all benefit corporations in Minnesota from 2016 to 2022. I collected 560 annual benefit reports from the Secretary of State's website over those years, produced by 184 different benefit corporations. And I also supplemented this with some additional data. I searched the Secretary of State Business Directory in Minnesota to find additional benefit corporations that have that title, but might not have complied for whatever reason with any reporting yet. And that got me to a total of 238 benefit corporations. And then I matched these data to B-Lab's B Corp certified directory and their B impact assessment scores. I found that there were 12 of those benefit corporations that are also B Corp certified, which allows for a comparison group. So I calculated the page length of their benefit reports, and I also searched through the text of those reports for references to B-Lab using a bunch of relevant terms that you can see here. And I'm going to kind of just present the compliance with reporting requirements, as well as some comparisons among these groups of interest, those that are B Corp certified, those that mention B-Lab even if they're not certified, and then everyone else. The first set of findings of 3 is consistent with prior literature. Reporting compliance in Minnesota in this context is fairly high, and that can be attributable to the fact that the Minnesota Secretary of State does require that those reports be submitted to the state, and they have a fairly consistent process for revoking the benefit corporation status of organizations that don't file. It can be reinstated, but it's something that is required, and hence you see fairly high rates of compliance relative to those who were required to in a given year based on their founding year, et cetera. But an additional note here is the graph on the right, that This is a histogram of the length of those benefit reports. And what you see is that there are a lot of short ones, maybe 0 or 1 pages, but this length varies a lot. There's actually a sort of power law-ish distribution where you have some organizations that have produced quite extensive reports. And so it's going to be interesting to think about what is yielding this, even though there's no requirement to produce a longer or anything above really one form being submitted with a handwritten note is the minimum that would count as compliant. Some firms are going way beyond that. So this is where we start to disentangle who's going above and beyond. And consistent with the hypotheses delivered, we do see the role of third-party standards here. So those that have been certified by BLab tend to have reports that are roughly 3 times as long as on average as those that are non-certified. So the mean of the certified B Corps in terms of page length of the reports is over 10, and the non-certified benefit corporations have a mean page length of maybe 3.4. So this is a considerable difference in the amount of detail that's produced and required among those different organizational populations. And that's true even if you measure tokens, which is like a word count or sentence number in those reports. The second hypothesis has to do with those legal structures that do the general benefit corporation require a third-party standard or do not. It's in the case of the specific benefit corporation. Minnesota is a unique case because they would have both types that firm could choose among. Here again, we see a smaller but still notable difference in the average report length on all 3 margins that we might measure. And finally, among those firms that are not B Corp certified, we still find that those that are mentioning BLab and claiming to use this or refer to it maybe as the third-party standard have longer reports than those that do not, which is an interesting spillover consistent with hypothesis 3. Now, an additional and final finding is that when you put these all into a single regression, a Poisson regression here, what you find is that the statistical significance of that legal requirement actually goes away once it's in the same regression with that certified B Corp status and firms referencing BLab in their reports and a few other controls. Now, this is something where to know if it's positive or negative in terms of coefficients, you compare them to 1 because they're exponentiated for easy interpretation. Again, we find that the certified B Corp is greater than 1, so it's positive and statistically significant across all of those outcomes, suggesting that those that are certified are generating longer reports. And similarly, the references BLab is those non-certified, maybe that do reference BLab in their reports. You again see a positive and significant result. But for the general benefit corporations that are subject to a third-party standard, once you account for the impact of that third-party standard, there's no difference for those and that suggests that it is the private sector organizations that are enabling this distinction. So some takeaways from this. It really shows that in the face of sustainability legislation, which often has sort of ambiguous requirements about what it really means to be a sustainable business, organizations end up taking cues from social actors like BLab, and the market actually yields a solution there when determining what to produce in terms of reporting requirements. So the compliance with the law is in effect socially constructed, and these legal intermediaries, specifically BLab, plays a role in that process. In doing so, I've gone beyond a binary notion of compliance where firms are just reporting or not. We started there in terms of compliance rates, and that's where a lot of literature has looked. But I'm adding richness by showing that the depth of those disclosures varies a lot, and it's actually related to the influence that that firm has decided to engage with BLab, even for those that weren't certified directly. Overall, I think these results suggest a role for market-based solutions that would promote transparency and accountability rather than prescriptive legislative requirements, because it shows that firms are distinguishable even under a non-coercive policy regime. And it allows you through the market to see, even though the sustainability report has really few details about what you have to include, you see the market filling in those gaps and presenting information that allows stakeholders to discriminate among and understand at least some differences among those organizations that would otherwise look similar.